Just on these three alone, he's looking at a de facto life sentence.
From the very moment a defendant is involved in this system, someone else has control over their story. They want to define that person solely by the crime they may have committed. You have a sentencing date set, and the stakes are high. Both lawyer and client need to do everything in their power to prepare. But the question is, are you ready? I'm Doug Passon. I'm a 25-year defense lawyer, a sentencing consultant, and an award-winning documentary filmmaker. In Set for Sentencing, I'm going across disciplines and outside the box to help both lawyer and client expand their perspective, build on their skills, and get real results in the form of significantly reduced sentences. All of this in service to one goal: to bring more fairness, more compassion, and more justice to the sentencing process. So, are you ready? Then let's get set for sentencing.
I usually don't drink this early, but this is driving me to drink. So I've cracked open a presidential, a nice, presidential themed bottle for today.
Right.
Jefferson's Ocean, an official sponsor of the Set for Sentencing podcast. Not really. It's a Sunday afternoon. It's 2:16 Eastern time and 9 p.m. in France, where my amazing recurring guest, Mark Allenbaugh, the incomparable Mark Allenbaugh, is joining us at the wee hours of the French evening to talk about, I don't know, little recent development that might have been a little bit of press about this week. Apparently there was a search warrant and a raid or a search of Mar-A-Lago, which is where the former president lives. I'm not sure what's going on here, but that's why I have Mark Allenbaugh, sentencing guidelines guru, federal sentencing expert extraordinaire, on here we're going to break this down. We're going to talk about what's happening, what might happen. We talk about possible sentences that people might face. Now, I got to start by saying a few things, disclaimers. One, we don't know what we don't know. There's so much information we do not have. So obviously a lot of this is speculative, but we are going to make some predictions today, and it'll be real fun to see how accurate we are. Two, very important to stress the presumption of innocence. Right? We're talking about these potential crimes. We know there's been a finding of probable cause, but that doesn't mean someone's guilty. So we're just going to be doing hypothetical situations as if someone somewhere down the line ends up getting convicted of this. So the presumption of innocence is always important in our job. And I guess the biggest, I think, Mark, and you tell me if you feel this way too, but the sort of overarching theme here as I look at all these statutes and everything, we're just in such uncharted territory because this country has never seen anything like this. Our court system, our justice system has not seen anything the likes of this. So it's really hard to tell how this is all going to shake out, but we're going to do our best to explain it to you today on Set for Sentencing. Welcome back, Mark Allenbaugh. How's it going, man?
It's going well, Doug. Going well. A lot to discuss.
Yes, indeed. So let's just jump right in. So the first thing we're going to talk about here are there's two. If you've heard this spiel before, I'm sorry, I'm going to give you the quick overview, but there's really two major factors to consider when we are trying to decide if a person gets convicted of crimes like these, what kind of sentence will they be facing? The first is United States sentencing guidelines, which is complicated, esoteric calculations, which Mark is going to walk us through. And then there's also the operative sentencing statute called 18 USC section 3553, which if you haven't figured out, I always say, here we are broadcasting. I call this Studio 3553 because that is really the beating heart of sentencing. So we're going to go through those factors and just kind of give some broad strokes about what we think the sentence may be. We're going to talk about some other issues of like relevant conduct, or if in the worst case scenario, he gets convicted of some serious crimes, where and how would he serve his sentence? So let's dig in. Mr. Mark Allenbaugh, Esquire. Share your screen. You've got some visuals. So if you're listening to this on the podcast channels, you may want to bop over to the YouTube channel, which is Set for Sentencing, because there'll be some nice visuals here. But we have right now the first thing, which looks like attachment B from the search warrant at issue, property to be seized, which cites some statutes. Take it away, Mark Allenbaugh.
So these are the 3 statutes that were identified, as you just mentioned, in the search warrant. And what I've done here is I've just taken these 3 statutes, and I'm going to assume he's going to be convicted of these statutes either by plea or after trial, and to come up with, what is he actually looking at here. Now, of course, DOJ could charge him with additional statutes or additional counts. I'm just assuming 1 count for each of these statutes, but he could possibly be facing multiple counts for each of these statutes and other statutes as well. But just on these 3 alone, he's looking at a de facto life sentence, and I'll walk us through that here. So the first thing is kind of going through these particular statutes. 793 here, I bolded that. That's going to really be the operative statute, even though it's not the most serious one. It only carries a 10-year stat max. But as we'll see, for guidelines purposes, it carries the highest sentence for guidelines purposes. And of course, the second statute here is 1519. That's your obstruction of justice statute. And that actually is the most serious statute of conviction here. It carries a 20-year stat max. That is referenced to 2J 1.2, which is the obstruction of justice guideline. And I'm sorry, going back to the first one, the 793 statute, that's referenced to 2M 3.2. That's the particular guideline that for that statute of conviction, gathering national defense information. And it's very, very rarely utilized because that statute is very rarely charged. Since 2010, I found less than 24 cases involving 793. And then finally, we have the 2071 statute. That is similar to gathering basically either confidential sources or anything that has to do with the national defense. If you're obtaining these documents or information and you disseminate them without permission or without authority, you can be convicted of this 2071 statute, which, interestingly enough, if I remember correctly, this was a misdemeanor until Trump himself changed it to a 3-year stat max when he was president. Oddly, this is reference to the fraud guideline, and I'm not exactly sure why. I don't know how you would how it would fit within the fraud guideline, but that's the way the commission has it. So that particular statute, again, is only a 3-year stat max. So what Trump is looking at overall is a 33-year statutory maximum. He can be sentenced up to 33 years, assuming he is convicted of 1 count of each of these statutes. And I converted that to 396 months. So as I was saying, the way the guidelines work is when you have multiple statutes of conviction that go to all these different guidelines, the first thing you have to decide is whether they group together. I mean, is all this offense conduct related? And we're going to assume here that it is. It certainly appears that way. So if it's all grouped together, what you do is you look at the guideline that gives you the highest sentence. And this is going to be the 2M 3.2 guideline that starts out very high. It's one of the highest or the most severe sentencing guidelines under all the guidelines of the dozens and dozens of guidelines. This is it starts out almost at the maximum. So it starts out with a base offense level of 35. And again, for those who are not familiar with the guidelines, there's a range of 1 to 43, with 43 being the highest, and that generally means a life sentence, and 1 very low, that's like 0 to 6 months. So he's going to just start at a 35. And then from what I understand from the search warrant and other reporting on what DOJ's interest is in terms of what Trump has done in taking all these documents to Mar-a-Lago and what have you, he will get an aggravated role in the offense. In other words, this is going to be a conspiracy. Even if it's not charged as a conspiracy, it could be treated as one. and he's going to most likely get a leadership role of +4. And that's the highest aggravating role that he can get. And there, the aggravating role is, were there 5 or more other individuals involved in this, or was the offense conduct otherwise extensive? And certainly here it was very extensive to try to get all these different types of documents, something like 27 boxes of confidential or top secret material overall that Trump took with him that we're aware of to Mar-a-Lago. So it was very extensive. Of course, he did this while he was the president of the United States. Certainly there's an abuse of trust there. So he's going to get a +2. And again, he was charged with obstruction. So I'm assuming he's going to get convicted of obstruction. So that's going to add another 2 levels. And then assuming he pleads guilty, like most people who are charged with or are convicted of a federal offense, they end up pleading guilty. Over 96% do. He would get 3 levels off, and we get a total offense level of 40. Trump being Trump, it's highly unlikely that he'll accept responsibility and plead guilty. So if he was if he goes to trial and he's convicted, he's going to have an offense level of 43, which will max him out at 33 years. If he was just convicted on these 3 statutes. And obviously he's 76, so he wouldn't survive that. So what I did was just assuming at an offense level 40 in criminal history 1, I'm not aware of any criminal history that he has that would be countable. His guideline range is 292 to 365 months, which is very significant. So what I did here in the next slide is just a statistical analysis. I went through and looked at everybody that was that had a total offense level of 40.
By the way, I'm gonna interrupt 1 second. It's one of the things that bugs me about the guidelines is they always express the range in terms of months, and I think that sort of tends to obscure the reality of how severe sentences can be, because what does it really mean? So my math is not good, but I see 292 as the low end of a guideline recommended sentence, which is just over 24 years. Yeah. And then 365 would be the high end. Now, keep in mind, these are advisory guidelines. The judge doesn't have to follow those, but that is just to point of reference. I know you're going to reference these other cases, but just in the grand scheme of federal cases, that's a lot of time. Obviously, yeah. 24 months is a lot of 24 years is a lot of time, but we don't often see cases well, we do often see, unfortunately, because the guidelines are so punitive, but this is serious. That's the takeaway. Go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, so basically he's looking at 24 to 30 years roughly under the guidelines, or technically 292 to 365 months. So I just looked at all of the offenders that had this total offense level of 40, and it doesn't matter what their offense of conviction was, because they're all going to have the same sentencing range now. So they were criminal history 1, so they all had the 292 to 365 months. They were not subject to any mandatory minimum term, and he's not. And they had a statutory maximum penalty that they were facing of at least 300 months or 25 years. So there were 300 of those individuals between 2010 and 2021. And here we could see the sentencing distribution. This X here in the middle of this box, that indicates the average. So the average sentence for individuals like what Trump's looking at is 212 months. The median, which is this line here, was 213 months. And again, the range is 292 to 365 months. And what we could see here is that most, or 75%, what the top of the box indicates is the 3rd quartile or the 75th percentile, that 75% received 292 months or less. So if there's any good news, the good news for Trump would be that 75% or 3/4 of the people that had these same guidelines calculations received a sentence below the guidelines. But even so, not that they didn't receive very far below the guidelines. They didn't receive a sentence that was that far below the guidelines. It's 212, 213 months is still pretty significant. 25% or 75% of all offenders received a sentence of at least 10 years or greater. So, and what I'm going to show you in the next slide is any sentence over 4 years for Trump, given his age, likely
I
is a de
knew
facto
you were
life
going to
sentence.
get to life expectancy. I
Yes.
knew it because, and just people need to understand
Yeah.
there's two different life expectancy calculations. There's life expectancy for someone who's not in prison, and there's life expectancy for someone who is in prison, because the conditions of confinement take years off your life. And we're actually going to talk about this may even be worse based on what he could be looking at if he ever saw the inside of a prison cell. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but you said at the beginning, this is a de facto life sentence. This is a 76-year-old man we're talking about. So what do you got?
A 76-year-old man in poor health.
Well, not to hear him tell it, but go ahead.
Now, he is 76.2 years old as of today. His life expectancy is 87.3 years. So he has roughly about another 11 years to live. However, according to a study by Dr. Evelyn Patterson that's been cited repeatedly in federal and state courts as persuasive authority, she found, doing a very comprehensive study of inmates in New York, that on average, an inmate serving a long prison sentence, like over 5 years, can expect to lose at least 2 years of their life expectancy for every year of incarceration. So if he was incarcerated this year, obviously then next year he would be 77.2 years old and 78.2. And we could see here his life expectancy is reduced, according to Dr. Patterson, by 2 years. We can see it keeps going and going down to here. So in about 4 years, he would die in prison. That's where, on average, statistically speaking, what he would expect, what his life expectancy would be in prison. So any sentence over 4.5 years is going to be a de facto life sentence. So it's not going to matter if it's a 40-year sentence or a 15-year sentence or what have you, or the stat max, I should say, or even a 200-month sentence or a 10-year sentence. Anything over 4.5 years is going to result in him dying in prison.
Interesting. So we talked about, the guidelines, and then I think it's worth talking about Section 3553 for the very fact that none of these are mandatory minimum sentencing. So the guidelines they give the judge advice. They're called advisory. Judge doesn't have to follow them. What the judge does have to do is consider them as one factor, but he or she also has to consider 3553, which is a variety of factors. And typically what a defense lawyer is going to do is rely very heavily on those to say, Judge, these guidelines are too high and he's too old, and here's the real important consideration. So what does 3553 say? We'll just go down these one by one, and I just kind of want to get your take. I have my take, but the first most important factor under 3553A is the nature and circumstances of the offense, which is very difficult for us to talk about right now because we only know that there are some documents that we think are pretty serious that violate these 3 federal statutes that they thought were going to be at Mar-a-Lago and apparently were in Mar-a-Lago. We don't know anything else. And it does bear mentioning when I saw Merrick Garland's press conference and he said, we're going to be releasing the search warrant and the return of property, the receipts, basically, the inventory. My heart kind of sunk because I know that the real substance to that search warrant is still under seal, and that's called the affidavit. And the affidavit is what tells the real story about what's happening here, what they think is happening here, who's saying what about what's happening. Because the truth is, it's bad enough that the documents are there, but what makes it better or worse is, why does he have them? What has he done with them? Or what were his plans to do with him? So if we start veering into the lane of selling state secrets or compromising nuclear technology, or the Rosenbergs got executed for less. So the nature of the circumstance of the offense, I think, are going to be a huge factor here, and we just don't know. It's bad enough based on what we do know, but let's skip to the next one. History and character of the defendant, or history and characteristics of the defendant, is what the statute really says. Where do you go with that, Mark Allenbaugh?
Well, that's going to be tough for Trump. Given his background with nonprofits and all the trouble he had with his university and ripping off people, it's going to be very difficult to portray him as having done good deeds with his life, or as one would with most with most defendants, pointing to some charitable works or the good deeds that he's done.
He had a charitable trust, but I think it might be hard to argue that one.
That was a fraud. Yeah, that was found to be fraudulent. So yeah, that would be
oh boy,
that's going to be very, very difficult. Yeah.
But let's go back up to the guidelines though, because one thing we didn't talk about is this beast of a thing that we contend with as defense lawyers all the time called relevant conduct. So when you're back under the guideline regime, the guideline base, because all those things you talked about, he's never been convicted of a crime before. And due process, the instinct, the intuition would say, why would you be able to use all that stuff against him? He's never been convicted of any of it. That's not fair. And my response is, I agree, it's not fair, but the guidelines do not agree. The guidelines have this thing called relevant conduct, where if there's preponderance of the evidence, typically, that a person has committed other criminal offenses in their history, that they might be considered here. Do you think there's relevant conduct implicated? I mean, I could go down the list of things.
Huge.
Yeah. Like, okay, so the guidelines themselves may account for some of that, but in any case, history and character, the government gets to make their case about what, it's a defending your life situation. Everything you've ever done in your life, good, bad, or otherwise, comes in at sentencing. So I can imagine a whole litany of things, from obstruction of justice findings in the Mueller probe to campaign finance violations where he's a listed potential co-conspirator, to the fraud, the Trump University fraud, to the foundation fraud. I mean, I could go on and on. We have a limited amount of time, but I don't envy the defense lawyer who's going to have to make a case that his good character requires some mitigation, maybe just service to the country. I don't know what else.
I mean, that could be something. And he didn't take a salary, from what I understand, when he was president.
Good one, Mark.
Yeah. So I mean, that's something. But at the end of the day, what I would focus on more is his age and health.
Yes.
That would be, I think those are going to be critical factors, because going back to the slide of these similarly situated individuals, the average age for these individuals was 35. So he's over twice the average age of those who have committed similar offenses, similarly serious offenses. So and most, I think it's like less than 15% of those within the BOP right now are over the age of 50. And probably less than 8%, 8 or 9% are over 70. So he's already going to be an outlier as a result of his age and because of his medical conditions. I know he wanted to prove himself to be very healthy, and he beat COVID and all this other stuff. But I would not counsel him to make such arguments at this point, and have a full workup of his medical issues. Sure, he has, if he's not diabetic, he's pre-diabetic. He probably has a lot of heart disease issues. He probably has some drug addiction, from what I understand, Adderall and some other, I mean, he doesn't drink alcohol, but there's some other addiction that has been rumored in the press for a number of years. And all that could be taken into account as significant mitigators.
Yes. And so I would think those are still under characteristics. So there's, and I won't go through every 3553A factor, but I'll tell you the couple that jump out at me as being really sticky but really important are the need to promote respect for the law. That's one sentencing consideration, and afford adequate deterrence to criminal conduct. And this cuts both ways. There will be millions of people that say to arrest Donald Trump at all would be to promote disrespect of the system, that this is because of basically the propaganda machine that's working over time. But then there will other people that, or the whole reason the Department of Justice would take an unprecedented step like this is to say that if we don't prosecute him, then we could never, there will be no deterrence. The next person down
Right.
the line won't be deterred from doing this.
Right.
And there has to be a strong message sent. So to me, that's really maybe the heart and soul that's animating this whole endeavor by the Justice Department, because they had very, very serious decision to make, because they knew once they did what they did, the Pandora's box is open. The hellfire and storm has already been starting to be released, and this is real serious business. So let's move to predictions here. I want to know what you think, and this is pure speculation. He hasn't been charged. He's not guilty of anything at this point. If there was going to be a next step, presumably that next step was he would be indicted for some, if not all or more, of the offenses. What do you think the odds of that happening are?
Oh, north of 90%.
Why
DOJ is not in the business of just getting search warrants just to pick up mail and documents that somebody may have errantly taken with them when they left their federal employment. They don't do that. This is basically this. I know some people mischaracterize it as a raid, but this is what the DOJ does every day. This is what the FBI does every day whenever they're serving search warrants in any federal case. There's really nothing unusual about it other than who the defendant was or who the target was. But aside from that, this is kind of run of the mill. This is how all cases start. A search warrant or an arrest warrant in some cases, but certainly a search warrant is served. They collect all the evidence, and then they build an indictment around it. I would expect an indictment within a few months, if not earlier. And then from there, it's going to be, what does Trump do? Is he going to fight it, or is he going to plead out? As we well know, most defendants plead out. Trump isn't most defendants. I don't see him pleading out. I see him fighting this and trying to drag it along. Hopefully he gets reelected or something like that, or gets somebody to pardon him down the road, or pardon himself. That could happen, but he's certainly, I think there's going to be an indictment and he's going to fight it. Now, whether he ever gets convicted, I think that's going to be more of how long he lives than anything else, to be honest.
Not how strong the evidence is.
Well, I think the evidence is going to be really strong, but I think he's going to be able to fight this and keep pushing back an actual trial date for years.
Yeah. And it'll be a political,
especially if a new administration comes in, or if the Democrats lose the Senate. There's going to be a lot of political machinations that can slow this down.
Yeah, to me, this is all about 2024, because if he is charged, he will be charged soon before that.
Right. Yes.
And this will be the issue, because, well, maybe. I guess maybe. I mean, if there was a Republican president elected in 2024, then he or she has a very big decision to make. But I guess that's ahead of the game. But I will tell you, I agree with you. I'd say definitely north of 90%. The only question is when, really, in my mind. There is a DOJ policy that they don't like to do this stuff too close to election time, and we've got election in 3 months. September, October, November. Some have opined that they're not going to stick to that it could come sooner. But I do think it's coming, and here's why. The very fact that they did this search warrant is massive. People don't understand. They would not have taken this step if they, first of all, know something we don't. and had the goods. Like there are lots of crimes that there has been probable cause that he's committed many crimes. I'm sorry if you're listening to this and you don't agree, but it's true. I'm not saying he's guilty, but just in the realm of probable cause, campaign finance, obstruction, whatever but nobody wants to indict a former president of the United States for small potatoes. And that to me tells me, A, this is big potatoes, and B, they have the goods, because they're not coming after the king unless they have the goods to go the whole 9 yards. So stay tuned on that. There's one last really interesting question. Well, I actually think there are two interesting questions, but one is far less interesting. But let's talk about it, because what the hell? Let's say, hypothetically, the indictment comes. The next step is he is arrested and brought to court for an initial appearance, and he is guaranteed under the law within 3 days to have what is called a detention hearing. The purpose of a detention hearing is to determine whether or not the former president could stay out on some kind of bond or home confinement, not be detained pre-trial while this whole thing goes along. We haven't talked about this offline, so I may be throwing you a curveball, but I do these detention hearings all the time, and I know that there are really two factors to consider. One is, are you a flight risk? And the other is, are you a danger? How do you think that works out for the former president at a detention hearing? Maybe, possibly.
Well, certainly a flight risk, without any doubt, with all of his ties overseas, from Saudi Arabia to Moscow to Pyongyang. So that's not going to bode well for him, and he also has the financial resources to flee.
And by the way, I'll do a little analogy. Drug cases. When we get these drug trafficking cases, and in those cases, there's a presumption of detention based on flight risk for that because the Congress decided people who are drug traffickers, especially high-level ones, have cash, they have international contacts, and other means to flee. So there's basically a presumption that has to be overcome by the defense. Now, this isn't a drug trafficking case, but I would say those same factors that make it a presumption there certainly apply. Certainly apply here. He's got his own plane for crying out loud.
Yes, right, exactly.
And lots of friends in every country.
Lots
of countries where extradition is not a thing.
Yeah, Pyongyang, North Korea. And the guy who was writing love letters to him would welcome him with open arms, I'm sure.
He's got a lot of places to run.
He has a lot of places to run, but and certainly if the press accounts are accurate, that he had in his possession nuclear secrets, who knows what else he might have out there. We don't know if DOJ has everything. And who he might try to arrange to release some of these documents to. So I think the danger to the community is pretty solid, unfortunately, for him. So I think the chances of him being detained are quite high.
There's another danger aspect, which is his mouth, his words, his rhetoric.
Yeah.
Which have already proven.
January 6th. Yeah. And as a matter of fact, just today, in 2 different cities, I think in Phoenix too, Trump supporters are outside of FBI. Armed Trump supporters were outside FBI buildings and threatening the FBI. And it happened in Ohio and Cincinnati, I think, a few days ago, where an individual showed up at the FBI headquarters there, field office, and started opening fire with a nail gun or something like that.
No, that was in Cincinnati.
Cincinnati.
And that was a couple of days ago, and he was killed. So someone's already been killed over this, basically.
Right.
Now, we're not going to say that's on Trump, but the truth is he's talking about corrupt FBI. They maybe planted evidence. This is what he's putting out on Truth Social, and this guy was all over Truth Social saying, and of course these politicians are saying we need to destroy our Arizona Senator Paul Gosar, who I'm quite sure isn't listening. But if he was, I would tell him he's a real prince of a human being. He says he has to destroy. He said we need to destroy the FBI. He came out, and Marge,
Yeah.
Marjorie Taylor Greene is now selling merch saying defund the FBI. So, there's an argument to be made that he's fomenting violence. Now, if
Right.
I were Trump's attorney, which I'm not, thank God, I would tell him he needs to go on True Social and tell everyone to chill the fuck out.
Yeah.
Because if this ever comes to pass where he has to answer for this, he needs to be in a position where people understand that whatever violence happening is not his doing.
Yeah.
So there's your free bit of legal advice. Someone told me I swear too much on this podcast too. That was the first F-bomb I dropped, and we've been on like 45 minutes, man. I should get a cookie. Okay, now we've got to this point where we both think there is a very significant chance that if he is indicted, that he will not be hanging out in Mar-a-Lago until trial, that he'll be in some kind of a facility detained awaiting trial, which gets us to the last but very interesting portion of this discussion. Should Trump be convicted and receive a sentence? What does that sentence look like in the Bureau of Prisons? And I will say, we'll go back and forth because before just inside baseball, but before we got on this call, we have some very significant contacts. I won't mention names, but who very much know what the process is inside the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And we've talked to that person, and they gave us some really interesting information. So let's just see if we can recreate this conversation. You go first.
Well, he's going to be subject to special administrative measures. I think that's what it's called, the SAM, or the SAMs. And those are for, they're approved by the Attorney General, and they're for high profile or very dangerous inmates, such as leaders of the Aryan Brotherhood and whatnot.
Or national security concern.
Or national security,
inmates.
right.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
So most likely where he's going to end up, if you're on a SAM, if you're subject to SAMs, he's going to end up at the AdMax in Florence, which is the Supermax, as it's more colloquially known. And he'll probably be in solitary confinement. There's no way that they're going to let him out into general population. And at the AdMax there, I think everybody's in solitary confinement anyway.
Yeah, I think so too. This Supermax in Florence,
right.
that basically everyone's in solitary,
right.
which means you have zero contact with any other inmate ever. Right. It means that any visitors that you might have must be first approved by the Department of Justice. It means no contact visits at all, period. And it means that any visits that are approved will be subject to live monitoring. So every word that is spoken will be surveilled, monitored, except if it's an attorney-client privilege prevents that. And it means every piece of mail that goes in and out for this person will be thoroughly scrutinized, right?
Well, on that, in this regard, I think this also might be a big mitigating factor for him. Certainly something that I would argue, in addition to his age and his medical issues, the fact of the matter is he's going to be going to a Supermax. And most defendants don't do that. Even those that commit very serious offenses don't end up at the Supermax. So, and he's a first-time offender. Arguably, he's not a terrorist, as other terrorists have ended up there. And he hasn't himself committed a violent offense.
Yeah.
So, that would be, for an elderly inmate who has a lot of health issues to go into an AdMax locked down 23 hours a day. That's going to be, that's significant. I think a significant mitigating factor. His time that he's going to be serving is going to be a lot harder than your average inmate, a lot harder.
Arguably the worst possible time any human being could ever serve in the United States of America.
Yes.
And you know these numbers, so I'll put you on the spot. Do you know roughly what the BOP prison population is these days?
About 140,000 within the
Okay.
BOP specifically.
Right.
Yeah.
And this person that we were talking to says there's probably less than 60 inmates of that 140,000 that would be under the SAMS program.
Correct.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
So I guess
And no Secret Service. He would most likely not. His detail would have to go away once he's inside.
But the truth is, he probably wouldn't need it because he would have no human contact.
Right.
Although guards, I mean, I'm sure there's some contact with guards, so I don't know how that works. This is back to the uncharted waters thing. This is unprecedented. Can you imagine being the warden of a BOP facility saying, okay, well, we got Donald Trump coming your way, so have fun with that.
What a headache.
I cannot even wrap my head around how this all shakes out. But I think we did a pretty good job of laying out the possibilities. So I wanted to thank you for coming back. It's very late in France now, so I think I'm going to let you do whatever you're doing. Go to sleep or whatever's next on your agenda for tonight. But undoubtedly, Mark Allenbaugh, you will be back speaking with us soon on Set for Sentencing. Anybody's interested in what Mark has to say, he's got a great website, sentencingstats.com. And, I don't know what else to say, but wow, it's a lot. This is a lot.
Oh, one last thing, though.
I have whiskey. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. From what I understand, tomorrow, they're litigating whether to release the affidavit that was tied to the search warrant. A bunch of news organizations have filed motions to have that released, and I think the court set a hearing for tomorrow on that.
Interesting. Okay, I didn't know that, and I think that is highly, highly significant because I think that the way that the response by the DOJ tells us how secretive, highly confidential this information is, because if it's as bad as we suspect it may be, they're going to have to either fight tooth and nail to prevent the release, or the release is going to be so heavily redacted, it's just going to be a sea of black ink.
Correct.
So, and
that's probably
if it is, that tells us two things: A, very, very highly sensitive contact, and B, lots of people out there who are informants, who are participating in this prosecution, who are giving information to the Department of Justice that they need to protect their identity. So the more, I would say, the more black ink you see, if it's ever released at all, the more that tells you that some big stuff's coming down the pike. That's my 2 cents. You think so? You agree?
Yes, I agree.
Okay.
I agree.
Oh boy, how interesting. Yep. All right, my brother. Thank you so much for doing this. I will.
Okay, Doug.
Soon. Be well. Be safe.
Au revoir.
That's it for today. But before we go, I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you to you, the listener, for spending time with us today, getting set for sentencing. Whether you're a lawyer, someone who could use the help, or maybe you're just a true crime buff who loves the inside scoop on how this whole thing works, I am so glad you're here, and I hope you keep listening. If you like the podcast, please do me a favor. Spread the word about Set for Sentencing and give us a rating and review on the iTunes podcast platform. It would really help. Last but not least, if you're interested in knowing more about what I do, mitigation videos, case consults, live teaching, on-demand educational content, books, articles, all of it, please visit www.dougpassonlaw.com. I'm Doug Passon. Until next time, hang in there. Wait a minute, that's a stupid way to sign off a podcast about sentencing. Hang in there. What's the matter with you, man? I guess they call that gallows humor. Sorry. All right. Well, I will see you next time on Set for Sentencing. Bye-bye.